Long before the introduction of written characters, the inhabitants of prehistoric Japan during the Jomon period relied entirely on oral traditions to pass down their tribal legends. Without a native script, stories of spirits and ancestral hunters were spoken around hearths in sunken pit dwellings covered by conical thatched roofs. The sounds of early Japanese echoed through coastal settlements, recorded only in memory and spoken word. As the Yei period brought wet rice farming and metallurgy from continental Asia, trade networks expanded across the Tsushima Strait. Although copper mirrors and iron tools entered the Japanese archipelago, the people still possessed no system of writing to record their agricultural yields or political alliances. Speech remained the sole medium of governance, keeping the islands silent in the written records of history. In the mid-3rd century, Chinese historians compiled the Jishuajinden, a text that recorded details about a mysterious queen named Himiko ruling the land of Wa. The chronicle described a society of wooden stockades and sacred rituals, marking the first time Japanese names were captured in Chinese characters. For Wa elites, these imported characters represented both foreign power and an unfamiliar magic that froze spoken names onto bamboo strips. According to the Nihon Shoki Chronicle, the formal introduction of written texts occurred in the early 5th century when the Bikage kingdom on the Korean peninsula sent a scholar named Wani. Wani arrived at the court of Emperor Ajin carrying 10 scrolls of the Analects of Confucius and 1 scroll of the 1,000-character classic. These texts introduced the Japanese court to the complex strokes of Han Dynasty Chinese script. The arrival of Confucian classics and Buddhist scriptures presented a monumental linguistic barrier, as Chinese and Japanese belonged to completely different language families. Classical Chinese was an analytic language with a subject-verb-object structure, relying on single monosyllabic words. In contrast, native Japanese was an agglutinative tongue with a subject-object-verb word order, using complex verb conjugations and grammatical particles. To manage administrative affairs and diplomatic relations, early Yamato state officials had to learn to write Classical Chinese, a system known in Japan as kanbun. Scribes from immigrant families, known as fuhido, sat in low-story wooden palaces with open corridors to copy official documents on narrow wooden strips called makin. These early records were written entirely in the syntax of the Chinese imperial court. Writing in kanbun required a Japanese speaker to completely rearrange their thoughts, translating native concepts into foreign grammar. A scribe would write a sentence in Chinese characters, but when reading it aloud, they had to mentally jump across the page to match Japanese syntax. This artificial process made administrative work slow and restricted literacy to a small group of court scholars. By the late 7th century, the Emperor Temu ordered the compilation of national histories to consolidate imperial authority, demanding a more precise way to write down native myths. Scribes could no longer rely solely on Classical Chinese, which struggled to capture the specific pronunciations of local place names and sacred Shinto deities. The court needed a method to write the sounds of the spoken Japanese tongue. The solution emerged in the 8th century with the development of hiragana, a system that used Chinese characters purely for their phonetic values. Instead of representing meanings, characters like knight or gold were selected solely because their Chinese pronunciations sounded like Japanese syllables. This innovation allowed scribes to write down the exact sounds of Japanese words, ignoring the original definitions of the characters. In the year 712, Ono Yasumaro completed the Kojiki, the records of ancient matters, using a complex hybrid writing style that blended Chinese and hiragana. Yasumaro struggled to balance the phonetic spelling of native songs with the grammatical structure of Chinese prose. His compilation preserved the oldest Shinto creation myths, proving that the native tongue could be preserved on ink-stained paper scrolls. The Manyoshu, a massive 8th-century poetry anthology compiled by Otomo no Yakamachi, contains over 4,500 poems written entirely in hiragana. Noblemen and provincial guards wrote their verses on parchment, using complicated Chinese characters for every single syllable. A simple love poem required writing dozens of high-stroke characters, making writing a task of immense physical endurance. Writing in hiragana was so tedious that a single page of text could take hours to complete. A scribe writing the word yama had to ink the entire complex character for night, followed by the character for 10,000. This inefficiency began to choke the imperial bureaucracy of the Nara capital, as administrative documents became massive scrolls filled with repetitive, high-stroke kanji. As the government expanded, wooden tablets excavated from the site of Heijokayo Palace reveal that scribes began taking shortcuts. Scribes would hastily write characters, leaving out strokes or connecting lines in a rush to record tax payments of rice and cloth. These informal simplifications on Makan wood strips were the very first seeds of a phonetic revolution in Japanese writing. In the late Nara period, Buddhist monks at temples like Tadaijai were faced with a different linguistic problem. They had to read complex Sanskrit and Chinese Buddhist sutras aloud, translating the characters into Japanese grammatical order in real time. To aid their students, senior monks began scratching tiny symbols next to the Chinese characters, using thin bone styluses on paper scrolls. These tiny scratch markings, known as kanji, served as punctuation and grammar guides for reading Chinese texts in Japanese. Monks studying at Nara temples used these symbols to indicate where to pause, which particles to insert, and when to jump to the end of a sentence. This system allowed scholars to chant the scriptures with correct Japanese pronunciation, bypassing the rigid Chinese syntax. In the year 794, Emperor Kanmu moved the imperial capital to Heian, modern-day Kyoto, initiating a golden era of peace and cultural refinement. As the court grew more isolated from Tang Dynasty China, a distinct Japanese aesthetic began to flourish. This political shift away from Chinese dominance created a space for the development of native scripts that better suited Heian aristocratic life. In the early Heian period, court women who were excluded from formal education in classical Chinese began developing their own writing style. While noblemen continued to write administrative documents in rigid kanji, women wrote in cursive hiragana, smoothing out the sharp angles of Chinese characters. This flowing style of writing was called onade, which translates to the women's hand. The cursive onade script evolved by running the brush quickly across the page, transforming complex kanji characters into soft, simplified curves. The character for peace, pronounced "en," was written with a single fluid stroke, eventually becoming the hiragana character for the sound "a." Over several decades, this process of simplification reduced dozens of hiragana characters into a set of phonetic symbols. Hiragana allowed Heian writers to capture the natural flow of spoken Japanese, for the first time without the constraints of Chinese grammar. It was a phonetic alphabet where each symbol represented a single syllable, such as ka, kai, ku, ki, or ko. The new script was highly expressive, making it the perfect medium for personal letters and waka poetry in the imperial court. In Heian, noble ladies lived behind layered silk screens in dark wooden palaces, communicating with the outside world through written letters. Since court etiquette forbade men and women from meeting face-to-face, a folded paper note written in elegant hiragana became a vital tool of courtship. The quality of a lady's brushstrokes could determine her status and attract potential suitors. The use of hiragana quickly spread beyond love notes to formal literature, enabling women to bypass the rigid, male-dominated world of classical Chinese writing. For Heian noble ladies, hiragana was a vehicle of liberation that allowed them to write diaries and novels in their native tongue. It changed the imperial court from a cold administrative center into a vibrant hub of poetic expression. In the early 10th century, the imperial court officially recognized the power of the new script when Emperor Daigo commissioned a grand poetry collection. This project was the Kakin Wakashu, compiled in the year 905 by the court poet Kaino Tsuruyuki and his colleagues. It was the first imperial anthology to feature poems written primarily in the native hiragana script. To justify the use of hiragana in an official imperial project, Kaino Tsuruyuki wrote a famous introduction known as the Kanajo. Written entirely in hiragana, the Kanajo argued that poetry was the natural expression of the human heart, reacting to the seasons and life events. This preface established hiragana as a medium of high art, equal in prestige to classical Chinese. Kaino Tsuruyuki further pushed the boundaries of the script in the year 935, when he wrote the Tosa Nikki, or Tosa Diary. To write a personal travelogue filled with grief and humor, Tsuruyuki adopted the persona of a female narrator. He chose hiragana because the rigid structure of classical Chinese could not express the deep sorrow he felt after his daughter's death. By writing the Tosa Nikki under a female guise, Kainotsu Yuki proved that hiragana was not just for court ladies, but was a superior tool for emotional prose. His work broke the gender barrier of writing, showing that men could also use the flowing script to write literature. This diary set a precedent for future generations of Japanese writers to express private thoughts. During the late 10th century, the Heian imperial palace witnessed an explosion of female-authored literature that would define Japanese culture for a millennium. Noblewomen serving in the imperial court spent their days in wooden palace chambers, writing on handmade paper sheets using ink and brushes. These women observed the rituals, scandals, and natural beauty of court life, recording them in hiragana. Around the year 1001, Sei Shonagon, a lady-in-waiting to Empress Teishi, completed a collection of essays and lists known as the Pillow Book, or Makura no Soshi. Written in sharp, witty hiragana, the text recorded Shonagon's personal thoughts on aesthetics, annoying court officials, and daily occurrences. Her writing captured the immediate sensory experience of court life, with unprecedented clarity and humor. A few years later, in approximately 1008, another court lady named Murasaki Shikabu wrote the Tale of Genji, which is widely considered the world's first novel. Serving the Empress Shoshi, Murasaki used hiragana to weave a complex narrative about the romantic and political lives of the imperial court. Her sweeping masterpiece spans 54 chapters and features hundreds of detailed characters. Without the development of hiragana, the Tale of Genji could never have been written, as classical Chinese could not capture the subtle psychological nuances of Murasaki's characters. The flowing script allowed her to write internal monologues, delicate waka poetry exchanges, and complex social interactions. Hiragana gave voice to a distinct Japanese consciousness, separate from the ancient cultural shadow of mainland China. While hiragana was developing in the private quarters of court ladies, a parallel writing revolution was taking place in Buddhist monasteries. In temples like Tadaijai and Kafukujai, monks spent their lives transcribing and translating massive libraries of sacred Chinese texts. To study these texts, they needed to write quick pronunciation guides directly onto the margins of sacred scrolls. The margins of Buddhist scrolls were too narrow to fit full manhyagana characters, forcing monks to invent a more compact phonetic system. They began taking small parts or fragments of kanji characters to represent individual Japanese syllables, a process that created katakana. The word katakana literally translates to fragmented or partial characters, referencing this unique method of structural abbreviation. To write the sound I, monks took the left-hand radical of the kanji character, I, which meant he or that. For the sound ko, they took the top right corner of the kanji character Chinese letter, which meant oneself. This systematic dismantling of complex Chinese characters yielded a set of simple, angular symbols that could be written in a fraction of a second. By the early 9th century, these angular katakana symbols were being used to gloss Buddhist texts like the Lotus Sutra. Scribes wrote katakana characters in red or black ink between the vertical lines of Chinese texts, providing instant readings for complex terms. This allowed younger monks to read the sacred scriptures aloud in Japanese, without having to master Chinese grammar. Unlike the flowing, rounded strokes of hiragana, katakana was sharp, straight, and geometric, reflecting its origins as a scholarly tool. It was written using the same brushwork as formal kanji, but stripped of all decorative flourishes. This angular aesthetic made katakana highly readable at small sizes, perfect for crowded margins and quick annotations on strategy maps. In the 9th century, the famous monk Kyukai, also known as Kobo Daishi, returned from Tang, China and founded the Shingon school of Buddhism. Tradition often credits Kyukai with the invention of the Kana system, though modern historians view him as a key popularizer rather than the sole creator. Kyukai's influence helped spread the phonetic scripts from Nara monasteries to provincial schools. Kyukai is also traditionally associated with the creation of the Iroha poem, a famous pangram that contains every single character of the Japanese phonetic alphabet exactly once. The poem reflects on the impermanence of life, drawing from Buddhist teachings on transience and the path to enlightenment. For centuries, children used the Iroha poem to memorize the order of the Kana characters. By the mid-Heian period, the Japanese writing system had split into two distinct paths, divided by gender, purpose, and social status. Noblemen wrote their official administrative documents in Kanban using Chinese characters, viewing it as the only script worthy of statecraft. Meanwhile, they used katakana for personal journals and private notes, while hiragana was reserved for literature and love letters. The division was so strict that hiragana was referred to as onade or women's hand, while classical Chinese and katakana were called otacode or men's hand. If a nobleman wrote an official state document in hiragana, he would be mocked by his peers for lack of education. Writing was a rigid social marker, defining a person's gender and position in the imperial bureaucracy. Despite this official bias against hiragana, the script's emotional expressiveness made it impossible for noblemen to ignore in their private lives. When writing a poem to a lover or a close friend, noblemen abandoned rigid kanji and brushed their thoughts in flowing hiragana. This created a bilingual elite who moved fluidly between the masculine world of kanji and the feminine world of kana. In the late Heian period, these two parallel scripts began to merge, creating the foundation for the modern Japanese writing system. Scribes realized that combining kanji and kana could offer the best of both worlds, using kanji for core meanings and kana for grammatical particles. This hybrid style, known as kanji-kana majiribo, allowed for unprecedented precision in written communication. The transition to this mixed script is visible in documents from the late 12th century, during the transition to the Kamakura period. As the power of the Heian court waned, the rising warrior class needed a practical way to write laws, contracts, and military logs. They adopted the mixed kanji-kana style because it was faster than classical Chinese and more precise than pure kana. In the year 1185, Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, shifting political power away from the Kyoto court to the samurai of the east. The new military government issued its legal code, the Gosabai Shikimoku, in the year 1232, using a simplified version of the kanji-kana mixed script. This legal text was written so that provincial samurai who lacked classical education could read the law. The Gosabai Shikimoku proved that the mixed kanji-kana script was suitable for official state law, breaking the monopoly of classical Chinese. Samurai commanders could now read decrees directly, reducing their dependence on court scribes. The script became a tool of military administration, spreading from the Kamakura capital to every warrior household across the provinces of Japan. As the military class embraced the mixed script, medieval literature began to reflect the new writing style, most famously in war chronicles. The Tale of the Heike or Heike Monogatari, which describes the Genpei War between the Minamoto and Tara clans, was compiled using kanji-kana majiribo. This epic was read aloud by blind lute priests, who used the written text to guide their oral performances. The opening lines of the Heike Monogatari, reflecting on the sound of the Jinshoja bells, are a famous example of the mixed script's poetic power. The authors used kanji to ground the Buddhist philosophical terms, and kana to create a rhythmic, flowing cadence. This stylistic blend allowed the tragedy of the fallen Tara clan to resonate deeply with both nobles and common soldiers. During the Muromachi period, which began in the 14th century, the use of kana continued to expand beyond the elite circles of samurai and priests. Zen Buddhist monks at temples in Kyoto, such as Tenryujai, used katakana to print affordable editions of Chinese classics. These Gazenban publications made academic texts accessible to a growing class of educated commoners and local administrators. In this era, trade and commerce flourished, and merchants in cities like Sakai and Hakata needed a simple writing system to keep records. They used basic hiragana to write invoices, ledger entries, and letters to trade partners across the provinces. The ability to write in kana became a practical business skill, liberating merchants from their reliance on professional scribes. The spread of literacy was further accelerated by the rise of terakoya, or temple schools, which began to emerge in the late medieval period. In these humble classrooms, Zen monks taught local children how to read and write using basic hiragana characters. Children practiced their strokes on reusable wooden boards, tracing the curves of the phonetic alphabet until they could write their own names. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate established peace in the early 17th century, the townspeople of Edo, modern Tokyo, had become highly literate. The Edo period saw an explosion of commercial publishing, with woodblock printed books known as kusazoshi becoming popular. These books were written in hiragana and simple kanji, making stories of ghosts, samurai adventures, and urban gossip accessible to the general public. In these woodblock prints, publishers placed tiny kana characters, known as furigana, next to complex kanji characters to indicate their pronunciation. This printing technique allowed readers of all education levels to enjoy complex historical novels and philosophical essays. Furigana bridged the gap between the classical Chinese character set and the spoken Japanese vocabulary of the common people. In the late 16th century, Christian missionaries from the Society of Jesus arrived in Kyushu, faced with the challenge of learning Japanese. To teach their priests, the Jesuit press at Amakusa printed the Nippo Jisho, a Japanese-Portuguese dictionary, in the year 1603. This historic text used Romanized letters, kanji and hiragana side by side, marking the first Western study of the Japanese kana writing system. During the peace of the Tokugawa era, hiragana was not yet standardized, meaning a single sound could be written in multiple ways. These variant characters, known as hentegana, were based on different cursive kanji characters and were used interchangeably in handwritten scrolls. A single love letter could contain 3 different symbols for the sound ka, requiring readers to recognize dozens of variant scripts. At the same time, katakana found a new role in the documentation of scientific knowledge, particularly in the study of foreign medicine. Scholars of Rangaku, or Dutch learning, used katakana to transcribe the foreign names of chemical elements and anatomical parts on paper scrolls. In Nagasaki, the only port open to Dutch merchants, translators relied on katakana to write down foreign terms. The dual system of hiragana and katakana allowed Japanese intellectuals to translate Western scientific concepts without losing their grammatical structure. They used katakana to phoneticize unfamiliar Dutch words and hiragana to provide the necessary Japanese particles and verb endings. This linguistic flexibility helped Japan absorb Western medicine and astronomy during its 2 centuries of isolation from the world. The year 1868 brought the Meiji Restoration, a political revolution that abolished the Tokugawa shogunate and restored imperial rule under Emperor Meiji. The new government embarked on a rapid campaign of modernization, determined to transform Japan into a leading global power. To achieve this, the Meiji leaders realized they needed to reform the education system and simplify the written language. In the late 19th century, the complex writing system of kanji, classical Chinese, and multiple variant kana was seen as a barrier to national progress. Some radical reformers, such as Mijima Hisoka, even proposed abolishing kanji entirely and writing Japanese solely in hiragana or Roman letters. Mijima argued that a simplified script would speed up communication and help educate the masses. While Mijima Hisoka's proposal to ban kanji was rejected, the government recognized that the sheer number of hentegana variants confused young students. In the year 1900, the Ministry of Education issued the Elementary School Order, which standardized the Japanese writing system. This historic decree officially designated only 1 hiragana character and 1 katakana character for each of the 48 sounds. This reform in the year 1900 effectively eliminated hundreds of hentegana variants from primary school textbooks, simplifying literacy for future generations. The remaining variant kana were relegated to calligraphy, traditional signage, and artistic printing. This standardization marked the birth of the modern kana orthography, creating a uniform script that every citizen across Japan could read and write. As primary schools opened across the nation under the Meiji education reform, millions of children learned the standardized 48 kana characters. In classrooms with wooden desks, students dipped their brushes in black ink to practice the stroke orders of hiragana and katakana. This massive educational push raised Japan's literacy rate to one of the highest in the world by the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, katakana became the official script for military dispatches, legal codes, and formal telegrams, while hiragana remained the script of literature and daily life. Telegram operators at offices in Tokyo sent messages using katakana characters, as they were easier to transmit via telegraph wires. The angular script was associated with the modern public sphere of the Japanese Empire. Despite the standardization of 1900, the spelling of kana remained historical rather than phonetic, meaning words were written based on ancient pronunciation. For instance, the word for today, pronounced kaiou, was still spelled as kefu, reflecting the language of the Heian period. This gap between the spoken and written language continued to complicate education for school children for decades. Following the end of World War II, the Japanese government undertook a comprehensive orthographic reform in the year 1946 to modernize the written language. The Ministry of Education introduced the Gendai Kanakai, or modern kana usage, which aligned spelling with the actual sounds of spoken Japanese. This reform abolished historical spellings like kefu and replaced them with modern phonetic spellings. The 1946 reforms also defined a list of Toyo kanji, limiting the number of Chinese characters taught in schools to 1,850. Kanji that fell outside this list were written in hiragana, further increasing the reliance on the phonetic script in daily newspapers and government documents. This change made written information far more accessible to the general public. In modern Japanese orthography, the roles of hiragana and katakana are clearly defined, working in harmony with kanji to create a unique visual layout. Hiragana is used for grammatical particles, verb conjugations, and native words that lack kanji. Katakana, on the other hand, is primarily reserved for transcribing foreign loanwords, scientific names, and sound effects. When a modern Japanese speaker writes a sentence, they use 3 different scripts simultaneously, a practice that arose from centuries of cultural adaptation. For example, in a simple sentence about eating bread, the verb root is written in kanji, the grammatical endings in hiragana, and the word for bread in katakana. This orthographic mix allows the eye to quickly scan and understand written text. The development of kana also shaped the design of modern printing press types and digital fonts, which must accommodate 3 distinct writing styles. Font designers in Tokyo work to balance the complex multi-stroke structures of kanji with the flowing curves of hiragana and the sharp angles of katakana. This blend of styles presents a unique challenge for typesetting in newspapers and digital interfaces. In the digital age, inputting Japanese on keyboards and smartphones relies on a system that converts phonetic kana keystrokes into kanji. When a user types the phonetic sound on a device in Kyoto, the software presents a list of matching kanji characters for selection. This technology bridges the ancient phonetic kana system with the vast, semantic library of traditional Chinese characters. Without the centuries of linguistic evolution that created kana, the Japanese language might have been completely Romanized or remained bound to classical Chinese syntax. The creation of hiragana by court women and katakana by Buddhist monks allowed Japan to preserve its unique spoken tongue in written form. These scripts represented a triumph of native cultural identity over foreign linguistic hegemony. Today, the historical evolution of the writing system can still be traced in the ancient manuscripts preserved in Nara and Kyo. Visitors to the Shasen repository in Nara can view early 8th century documents showing the messy transitions from kanji to manhyagana. These ink-stained papers are the physical evidence of the long, creative struggle to capture the Japanese voice in writing. The physical act of Heian writing relied on precise tools that noblemen and women crafted with great care. Calligraphers in Heian sat on woven straw mats, grinding charcoal sticks in water on dark stone inkstones to produce fresh black ink. They dipped brushes made of fine animal hair into the ink, guiding the bristles across sheets of paper to create flowing lines of hiragana. The aesthetics of kana calligraphy, known as shodo, became a highly valued art form in the medieval courts. Writers carefully adjusted the speed and pressure of their brushes, expressing their personal emotions through the varying thickness of the ink lines. In Heian society, a person's calligraphic style was believed to reveal their inner character and level of cultural refinement. To showcase their calligraphy, Heian aristocrats wrote on highly decorated paper called ryoshi, which was dyed in multiple shades. This luxurious paper was sometimes imported from Tang China, or handmade in provinces like Echizen from the fibers of Gampi and Kozo plants. The paper was often decorated with gold dust or silver leaf, providing a beautiful background for the brushed hiragana poems. Calligraphic beauty was critical during the waka poetry contests, known as yudo-wace, held in the imperial palace. Noble contestants submitted their hiragana poems on carefully chosen colored paper that matched the seasonal theme of the contest. The judges evaluated both the literary quality of the verse and the elegance of the calligraphic brushwork, awarding prestige to the most skilled writers. In the early 10th century, the Ise Monogatari or Tales of Ise was compiled in hiragana, combining waka poetry with short narrative prose. This collection of anonymous tales followed the romantic exploits of a courtier, traditionally identified as the poet Ariwara no Narihira. The flowing script allowed the stories to spread widely, popularizing the courtly ideals of romance and sensitivity. Another important literary work was the Sarashina Nikki, or Sarashina Diary, written in hiragana during the 11th century by the daughter of Sugawara no Takasu. Her memoir described her deep love for romantic tales, her long pilgrimages to Buddhist temples, and her daily life in the provinces. Writing in hiragana allowed her to express her personal dreams with an intimate and honest voice. The Kajero Nikki, or the Gossamer Years, written in the 10th century by the woman known as the mother of Fujiwara no Michitsuna, is a classic diary written in hiragana. The text describes the difficulties of her marriage and her emotional struggles as a court wife. Her honest depiction of family life represents the early development of psychological realism in Japanese literature. While hiragana captured the emotional lives of court women, katakana continued to serve academic and lexicographical purposes. In the late 11th century, scholars compiled the Ruiju Myajisho, a massive dictionary that organized thousands of Chinese characters. Scribes used katakana to write pronunciation guides next to the entries, making it easier for students to read the correct Japanese sounds. Even earlier in the 10th century, the scholar Minamoto no Shitego compiled the Wamyo Ruijusho, the oldest surviving Japanese dictionary of names. This comprehensive text categorized everything from animals and plants to tools and offices, providing their Japanese names in phonetic katakana script. The dictionary served as a vital reference tool, standardizing vocabulary across the imperial bureaucracy. During the Kamakura period, the Buddhist monk Myo of Kazanjai Temple kept a dream diary, known as the Yume no Nikki, for over 40 years. Myo wrote his dreams using a unique mixture of kanji and katakana, documenting his spiritual visions and theological thoughts. His diary stands as a rare psychological record of a medieval monk, written in the practical script of the temples. In the late 16th century, the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi brought a movable type printing press back to Japan from his military campaigns in Korea. This press, known as the Kaiko movable type, was used to print classic works of literature like the Tales of Ise. For the first time, hiragana texts were printed in large quantities, paving the way for popular reading. In the early 17th century, the artist Hanami Kotsu and the wealthy merchant Suminokura Son created the Sagaban books, which were masterpieces of printing. Using wooden movable type that replicated flowing calligraphy, they printed classical texts on beautiful decorated papers. These publications made hiragana literature visually stunning and highly sought after by wealthy patrons in Kyoto. The Hijoki, or An Account of My Hut, written by the poet Kamo no Chomai in the year 1212, is a classic example of medieval kanji-kana writing. Writing from a tiny wooden hut in the hills outside Kyoto, Chomai described the natural disasters that struck the capital. His use of the mixed script allowed him to write with both philosophical depth and emotional clarity. Another masterpiece of the mixed kanji-kana style is the Tsurajirgyusa, or Essays in Idleness, written by the monk Yashida Kenko between the years 1330 and 1332. Kenko wrote his essays on random thoughts, aesthetics, and anecdotes, blending Chinese wisdom with Japanese sensitivity. The balanced use of kanji and hiragana in his work became a model for classical Japanese prose. During the Ashikaga shogunate, the imperial court maintained a dedicated scriptorium called the Gakukumanjo to preserve the correct orthography of the kana scripts. Court scholars carefully copied classical texts to ensure that spelling rules, which were beginning to drift from spoken pronunciation, remained consistent. This institutional effort prevented the ancient literary language of the Heian period from being lost. The ordering of kana characters also evolved, with the Iroha poem being used to index Buddhist dictionaries like the Iroha Jurui Sho, compiled in the late 12th century. This dictionary organized vocabulary alphabetically using the syllables of the Iroha poem as headings. This indexing system made it far easier for scholars and students to look up words and pronunciations. In the 15th century, the playwright Zimi Matakio developed the no drama, writing scripts that relied heavily on hiragana to guide the performers. Zimi wrote the chants and dialogue in a poetic mixed script, allowing actors to easily read the emotional inflections and rhythms. These written scripts preserved the vocal style of classical theater, which is still performed today. During the 18th century, a group of scholars known as the Kokyugaku, or National Learning School, began studying ancient Japanese texts to recover native culture. Led by Matori Norinaga, they rejected the dominant influence of Chinese philosophy and focused on the language of the Kojiki. They realized that understanding the ancient phonetic kana was key to unlocking the true meaning of early myths. Matori Norinaga spent 35 years compiling the Kojiki-den, a massive 44-volume commentary on the ancient Kojiki Chronicle. Norinaga carefully deciphered the complex Manyagana characters, mapping them back to the original spoken language of the Nara court. His work restored the ancient text to readability, proving that the roots of Japanese culture were preserved within phonetic kana. The popularization of haiku poetry during the Edo period also relied on the accessibility and grammatical flexibility of hiragana script. Matsuo Basho, the famous haiku master, wrote his travel log, Oku no Hasamichi, in the year 1689 using a simple kanji kana style. Basho's verses were written so that ordinary people, not just wealthy scholars, could read and appreciate his poetry. In his famous haiku about the ancient pond and the sound of water, Matsuo Basho combined kanji for the concrete objects with hiragana for the action. The characters for pond, frog, and water were written in kanji, while the particles and verbs were written in flowing hiragana. This structural division created a sharp, minimalist visual image that matched the quiet mood of the poem. As the Bakumatsu period began and Western ships arrived in Uraga in the year 1853, katakana took on the role of recording Western words. Translators used the angular script to transcribe English names, military terms, and technology like steamships. Katakana became the linguistic interface between Japan and the outside world, adapting to the influx of new concepts from Europe. To facilitate communication, the American missionary James Curtis Hepburn created the Hepburn romanization system in the year 1867, mapping kana to the Latin alphabet. This system allowed Westerners to read Japanese phonetically and helped Japanese scholars study English. Hepburn's bilingual dictionary used standardized Roman letters alongside hiragana and katakana, promoting cross-cultural exchange. In the year 1889, the Meiji government promulgated the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, writing the document in a formal, classical style using katakana and kanji. This legal text, known as the Meiji Constitution, was printed on official scrolls using the angular script to project administrative authority. It showed that katakana was still viewed as the official script for imperial governance. The modernization of communication accelerated in the year 1869, when the government established the first telegraph service between Tokyo and Yokohama. The Meiji Telegraphic Code mapped the Japanese kana characters to Morse code, allowing messages to be sent quickly over electric wires. Because katakana was simpler and more distinct, telegrams were sent exclusively in the angular phonetic script. In the year 1915, an inventor named Kyoto Sugimoto patented the first Japanese typewriter, which featured a keyboard designed around kanji and kana. Sugimoto's machine arranged the characters on a rotating drum, placing the phonetic hiragana and katakana in accessible positions. This invention allowed offices to produce printed documents quickly, streamlining the administration of modern businesses in Tokyo. To manage the post-war changes, the government established the National Institute for Japanese Language and Linguistics in the year 1948. This institute was tasked with researching how the writing system was used and recommending guidelines for spelling and loanwords. They monitored the growth of katakana words, ensuring that the influx of English terms did not overwhelm the native grammar. In modern Japanese pop culture, manga artists use katakana to write sound effects, known as onomatopoeia, directly onto the panels of their drawings. The sharp, angular shapes of the script are used to visually represent actions like doors slamming, rain falling, or characters running. This creative use of katakana turns the phonetic alphabet into a dynamic graphic element on the page. Although the 1900 reform standardized hiragana, visitors to modern Tokyo can still see ancient hentegana characters on the wooden signs of traditional shops. Buckwheat noodle restaurants known as soba shops often display their name, kisoba, using the historical cursive kana for so and ba. These signs remain a living connection to the calligraphic style of the Edo period. Across the temples of Kyoto and the ruins of Nara, stone monuments are carved with the waka poems of Heian court ladies. The verses are carved in flowing hiragana, their rounded curves worn down by centuries of rain and wind. These stone inscriptions stand as permanent memorials to the women who shaped the written voice of a nation. In the quiet archive room of a museum in Kyoto, a dark horsehair brush sits resting on a stone inkstone. Next to it lies a single sheet of handmade mulberry paper, displaying the 48 cursive characters of the Iroha poem. The ink has long dried, but the simple, rounded shapes of the kana script remain clearly visible in the soft light.